Before we ride into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. The photograph shouldn't have existed. I found it the way you find most ghosts from Vietnam, half buried in a folder of miscellaneous, wedged between faded snapshots of supply convoys and men grinning beside helicopters. Mid-1960s, someone's handwritten date. No caption, no unit patch to point the way. Just a young American soldier standing in the thick, wet heat, sweat dark cloth, gear that looked almost right but not quite. His uniform was strange in the way a lie is strange. Close enough to pass at a distance, wrong enough to make your stomach tighten when you notice the details. And slung across his chest, held like it belonged there, was something that had no business in Southeast Asia at all. A German MP40, World War II, stamped steel, 9mm, an icon of another continent and another war. In Vietnam, it sounded ridiculous, like a rumor told too late at night in a hooch lit by a single bulb. Yet there it was, caught in grainy black and white, the muzzle pointed down, the soldier's eyes shaded, unreadable. The answer wasn't in the weapon itself. It was in everything the photo refused to show, because the man carrying that MP40 didn't belong to a normal unit. He belonged to an organization whose name sounded harmless on paper and lethal in reality. MACV-SOG, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. Studies. Observation. Words chosen like a disguise. In practice, SOG was a scalpel with no fingerprint. They were pulled mostly from special forces. Green berets who knew how to move quietly, live on little, and vanish into jungle the way smoke vanishes into night air. But even that wasn't the full story. SOG's missions didn't just hug the border, they slipped across it, sometimes into places the United States publicly pretended it had never entered. Laos, Cambodia, and on the blackest nights, even the edges of North Vietnam itself. They hunted what kept the war alive. Truck columns rolling under canvas, hidden ammunition dumps, camouflaged parks of vehicles, storage sites carved into hillsides, base camps that breathed and resupplied like living things. And always, looming over every plan like a serpent in the undergrowth, was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Less a single trail than a sprawling system of veins pumping men and weapons south through neutral countries that weren't neutral at all. The problem wasn't whether SOG could do it. The problem was that Washington couldn't admit they were doing it. So SOG built deniability into the bones of every operation. Teams wore uniforms without obvious US markings. Some carried no identification at all, no dog tags that could be traced back to a mother in Ohio or a records office at Bragg. Their radios, their paperwork, even the way their gear sat on their bodies, everything was chosen with one question in mind. If they find you dead, what can they prove? And that question didn't stop at clothing. It went straight to the weapon in your hands. Early on, the gun most associated with those shadow missions wasn't American. It was Swedish. The Carl Gustaf Model 1945, known to the men simply as the Swedish K Compact. Reliable, chambered in 9mm, and most importantly, foreign. The kind of firearm that didn't point back to a US armory. SOG teams carried it with the same seriousness they carried water. They packed ammunition the way other soldiers packed hope. Excessive, heavy, and absolutely necessary. A typical load might be one magazine seated and ready and a dozen more tucked into pouches. Enough rounds that your hips ached and your legs learned a new kind of fatigue. Not because anyone wanted a firefight, but because SOG had a hard rule. If trouble found you, you fought your way out. A recon team was small by design. 2 or 3 Americans, backed by 4 to 6 South Vietnamese operators who knew the land, the language, and the scent of danger in the air. They moved like a single creature when they were good. When they weren't, they died quickly. But SOG had another peculiarity, a privilege earned through risk and necessity, the right, sometimes, to choose personal weapons. Not from the standard US lineup, of course. That would defeat the point. The choices had to be foreign, unattributable, the kind of tools you could explain away if things went wrong. And that's where the MP40 came back into the story. MP40s existed in Vietnam for reasons that had nothing to do with Americans. Some had been captured by the Soviets in World War II, stored in vast depots, then handed off to fellow communists the way a man hands down a coat he no longer wears. Others were leftovers from the French colonial years, when Indochina was a grinding, bitter conflict and French units used whatever worked, including captured German weapons mixed in beside French and American arms. Old guns travel. They follow wars the way carrion birds follow storms. But the MP40s that ended up in American hands, those didn't come from a battlefield pickup or a friendly local deal. They came from a supply channel that ran quietly and efficiently through the kind of people who could get you almost anything on Earth if the paperwork was vague enough. The CIA. It's hard to explain to someone outside that world what it meant to request a weapon like the MP40 and actually receive it. Not because it was impossible, because for that network, it wasn't. But because it revealed something about how SOG operated. They didn't just break rules, they designed missions around the spaces where rules couldn't reach. So why choose a German submachine gun from the 1940s over something newer? Because in the jungle, controllability is a kind of mercy. mercy. The MP40 had a low rate of fire compared to many other automatic weapons of the era. It fired 9mm, manageable recoil, predictable behavior in close quarters. It was sturdy, simple, not finicky in the way some modern systems could be when choked with humidity and grit. At under 9 pounds, it was light enough to carry through miles of green hell without feeling like you were dragging an anchor, yet stable enough to stay on target when your heart was hammering and your fingers were slick with sweat. A gun you could keep honest when panic tried to jerk your hands. One former recon man described it like this: the MP40 didn't fight you, it went where you told it to go. That mattered when your engagements weren't long-distance marksmanship contests. SOG fought in the distances where you could smell wood smoke on an enemy's clothes. Mid-range to close range, quick bursts, movement, confusion, a moment of noise, then silence again. And this was no small thing. If you carried an enemy-style weapon, your shots didn't immediately scream American. In the jungle, sound carried like a confession. A K-fire was AK fire, and the enemy's head snapped toward it with instinctive understanding. Some SOG units used AKs for exactly that reason. Common sense. If you're behind enemy lines, sounding like the enemy can buy you seconds, and seconds are life. But AKs, especially on full auto, could climb and bounce. They wanted to run away from your shoulder. In a tight fight, that meant rounds going where you didn't intend, a problem when your team is scattered in brush, moving, crossing each other's lines. The MP40, by comparison, stayed calmer. It was almost civilized in its behavior, even as it did an uncivilized job. There's another image that surfaced later. Two SOG operatives wearing World War II-era US Marine Corps M42 duck hunter camouflage, a pattern designed for Pacific Islands decades earlier, resurrected in the war's strangest corners. Both men are armed with MP40s. No unit patches that matter, no neat explanation. Just the blunt truth that deniability sometimes looks like a costume department with a very dark budget. The MP40's magazine held 32 rounds of 9x19mm, close to what the Swedish K carried. But unlike the Swedish gun, the MP40 was an older, more expensive design in terms of production, more complex, a product of a different industrial philosophy. Yet in the field, those distinctions didn't matter. What mattered was, does it fire? Does it feed? Does it do what you need when you're far from help? Then the war shifted, subtly at first, then all at once. As the conflict dragged on, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces captured increasing numbers of US weapons. American rifles and carbines became common enough on the other side that the old logic of deniability began to crack. If the enemy could already produce an M16 from a cache, the political shock of finding an American firearm in Laos wasn't what it had been. So eventually, SOG's requirements changed. The veil didn't drop completely, but it thinned. And in that opening, a new tool emerged, one built for the kind of mission SOG ran, not for parade ground theory. The M177, short-barreled, compact, nasty at close range, a variant in the family line of the M16 and a clear ancestor of today's M4-style carbines. Early versions carried an extremely short barrel, around 10 inches, with a distinctive long flash suppressor/compensator that made the whole profile look like a clenched fist. It was designed to be carried through vines and tight brush, to come up fast, to be used in the sudden, close chaos that defined recon fights. Officially, it was issued with 20-round magazines, fine for conventional troops, but widely considered inadequate by men who planned for the worst because the worst found them so often. So team leaders improvised. Some bought 30-round magazines through unofficial channels and issued them alongside the standard load. In the shadows, practicality always outranked bureaucracy. Yet even then, despite newer purpose-built weapons entering the scene, old preferences lingered. Some recon men still favored an even older relic, the suppressed M3A1 Grease Gun, a .45 caliber submachine gun born in World War II. In certain configurations, it carried a suppressor, and it had a slow, controllable rhythm, around 450 rounds per minute, that made it surprisingly manageable. There was an irony in that choice too. The Grease Gun's suppressed lineage traced back to America's earlier shadow organization, the OSS, the CIA's wartime predecessor. Different wars, same kind of men, and that's the thread that runs through the photo, the MP40 in an American soldier's hands. Vietnam wasn't just a war of modern technology, it was a war of recycling, adaptation, and the quiet borrowing of anything that worked. Old weapons resurfaced because supply lines were strange, because secrecy demanded misdirection, because the jungle didn't care what year your gun was designed, only whether it fired when everything went bad. By the late 1960s, most of those World War II-era firearms faded from SOG use, replaced by more standardized options like the M177 and other systems that fit changing political realities. But the photographs remain, grainy evidence that history doesn't move in straight lines. It loops. It drags the past into the present and calls it necessary. So when I look at that mid-1960s image now, at the odd uniform, the odd gear, the MP40 slung like a secret, I don't see a novelty. I see a signature, not the signature of a man or even a unit. The signature of a war fought in places no one was supposed to talk about, by teams built to leave no trace, carrying weapons chosen not only for effectiveness, but for what they couldn't prove.